Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our panel on redefining the role of philanthropy in the North and South. We're coming to you from Alliance Magazine in London. We're being joined by speakers from all around the world, as well as you, our friends and colleagues from across the globe. I'm Elika Ruhi, the digital editor at Alliance and the moderator of today's digital event. We're going to be exploring the relationships in global philanthropy between the global North and the global South, particularly how they've shifted in the last several years through the intersecting crises, as well as how they need to continue to shift. But first, just a few notes today for everyone who is attending before we start our main event. For everyone who's tuning in, go ahead and say hello in our chat, which you should be able to access by clicking on the chat bubble on the right-hand side of your screen. We're interested in hearing from all of you today, so we're going to start off with a question to our audience. What philanthropist in the Global South inspires you the most? So if you have any thoughts on that question, go ahead and share in the chat, and we might get a chance to comment on that a bit later during our Q&A. Which brings me to, we'll also be taking questions from the audience. So if you have any that you'd like to ask our panelists, make sure to ask them here. You can also join in the discussion on Twitter with @AllianceMag and using the hashtag NorthSouthPhilanthropy. So if you didn't catch all of that, it's also on our slides in front of you. So you should be able to see our Twitter handle and the hashtag. Everyone who is attending this event today is entitled to a 20% discount on any Alliance subscription using the code EVENT22. An Alliance subscription gives you access to exclusive subscriber content, 4 issues of the magazine a year, and free access to all future events. We'll also be sending this out after the event is over, so don't worry about signing up for a subscription just yet. You can sit back and listen to our conversation first. You can find a link to our subscription page in the chat area now, but you'll also get it by email later. So now for the main event, I'd like to introduce our panel. We're delighted to have all of them with us today. We're joined by Riva Kantowitz, the founder of the Radical Flexibility Fund from New York. From Sao Paulo, we're joined by Maria Amalia Souza, the founder and strategic development director of the Casa Socio-Environmental Fund. From Addis Ababa, Adili Burku, the co-CEO of the African Visionary Fund, joins us. And from Mumbai, India, Anant Bhagwati, a partner at the Bridgespan group, joins us today. So we're honored to have all of you with us, and a special thanks to everyone for navigating the time zones, because I know we're joining from all around the world, but we're very happy to have you be a part of our conversation. So let's turn the floor over to Riva. The Radical Flexibility Fund, of which you are a founder, believes that there are more effective alternatives to the current system of funding, and you work with funders to help explore these alternatives. Can you talk to us a little bit about the work of the fund and how it sees its role in redefining relationships in global philanthropy?
Great. Thank you so much, Elika. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone from New York City. A big thank you to Alliance. I'm thrilled to kick off this conversation with such an esteemed group of panelists. So yes, I lead a new organization called Radical Flexibility Fund, where we are on a mission to create more impactful, sustainable pathways for donors to invest in local development and social change initiatives. We know the current donor paradigm is failing. We are getting a small percentage of funds, 4% of foreign aid and 11% of US-based philanthropic funding directly to organizations based in the countries in which they work. We bring together leaders and innovators from different parts of the donor and social change fields to develop and demonstrate that there are more effective alternatives to this current system. So to Elika's question, how do we do this? Our approach at RFF is summarized in what we call 10 radical actions, which you can find on our website. They are based on 3 pillars. First, really the heart of our work is around testing funding tools that are more flexible, more inclusive, and more sustainable than grants. Over the last several years, we've gathered a range of financing approaches, now more than 30 tools, such as outcome funds, community philanthropy, giving circles, cash transfers, community bonds, social enterprise. I always say we at RFF obviously didn't invent any of these approaches. they are just currently scattered throughout the funding and social change ecosystem, and they are not part of the mainstream. There's really very little knowledge of different financing approaches to support NGOs beyond grants. However, you can give the most flexible grant in the world, and it will still end, which creates an eternal treadmill and dependence on the current donor-driven paradigm. Our work convening community-based organizations to better understand how they finance their own priorities has shown that they already utilize a range of approaches, from the Nepalese NGO developing fee-for-service models to assess disaster preparedness, to launching social enterprises like the women-led Moroccan program Home Cooked Lunch, the proceeds of which support girls' education. We in the global north need to do a much better job of gathering these examples and supporting and amplifying these different approaches. In addition to tools, we have also identified several processes that describe how money moves along a pathway from point A to B. For example, participatory philanthropy is a very popular topic right now, but you can and should consider how to use participatory approaches in how you structure any type of financial tool. We feel that this is a really important point because we also talk a lot about things like innovative finance, but innovative doesn't necessarily mean more equitable, empowering, or effective for local organizations. So this is why we focus not just on gathering a wider range of tools, but on how they're used, paying particular attention to designing and deploying approaches in inclusive ways so that we are ensuring that we aren't just replicating the same power structures of the current aid model. So this brings me quickly to my second and third pillars. Second, we also believe you can't just use new tools without doing so in the service of communities' own priorities. In the current status quo, NGOs try their best, and I've been on this side of things too, try their best to make their case to funders, often being forced to filter their priorities or solutions to fit with donor agendas. This again creates an endless cycle of donor-imposed programming that doesn't necessarily speak to a community's actual challenges or how to solve them. There are several practical things donors can do to change this, which we talk about in 10 Radical Actions. For example, asking, how are these priorities determined? Are the people who are affected by a particular issue considered experts in addressing it? And finally, 10 Radical Actions also encourages funders to be accountable to the communities they serve rather than primarily their boards or parliaments. We believe we should support local communities to define the impact of their own work. What does success look like from the perspective of those who live the challenges these funds seek to address? If these funds haven't supported success from a community's perspective, what can we learn about that? And I'll close by underscoring that we believe when a community or group of stakeholders has the power to identify and fund their own goals, donors then become charged with enforcing the rules, standards, and priorities of that community rather than imposing their own standards, thereby shifting power and accountability to communities themselves. Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Elika.
Thank you, Reba. I think there's a lot of really interesting practical things there that you just shared. And a bit later on, and I hope we'll be able to come onto this question of, when we're thinking about redefining these relationships, we need to shift not just our practice, but our ideology. Otherwise, it's something that is trendy for a couple of years, and then it doesn't get adopted, I think, wholeheartedly by many in the sector. But maybe we'll get to explore that in a little bit more depth in a few minutes. But first, I want to turn the floor over to Amalia. So at the end of last year, the Casa Fund joined Alianza Socio-Environmental Fondos del Sur, which you'll have to excuse me because I'm not a Spanish speaker, but that means Alliance of Socio-Environmental Funds of the Global South. So this is an initiative to direct resources to local grassroots organizations that work on the front lines of the climate crisis. And the Alliance has partners in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, so it's truly a Global South initiative. So Amalia, we're hoping that you can tell us a little bit about the work of the Alliance and also why it's different than other intermediary funds that have worked to support climate interventions in the Global South.
Hi, hello, Elika. Can you see me? Because I can't.
Yeah, we can see you. Yeah.
Just making sure. Well, I actually, I'm really glad to be able to talk about this new thing we just created in the world, which is Aliança Socio-Ambiental Fondos del Sur, Socio-Environmental Funds of the Global South. And I'm really glad that I'm coming right after Riva, because exactly because of all these things that she was talking about, was that people like us, local communities who were actors in our own fields in the last 20 years, realized the great gap that there exists in the global philanthropic field, and how, of course, some organizations in our countries are capable of reaching and accessing these resources, which are very little, as we just heard. But there is the rest of society, I mean, the majority of society doesn't even show in the radar, for one, of philanthropy. Plus, they don't even know this field exists at all. And so after working for 30, 40 years, activists in a series of fields, and us specifically as environmentalists, knowing that there is no way you can protect a forest without involving and empowering or demonstrating the protagonist role of local communities and resourcing them so that they don't have only their own lives to give to protect the forest, but that they have means and tools and resources. That's the only way that we can protect our planet. So a few of us popped out around the world, in Mexico and Southeast Asia, and we're very few groups. And we started coming to the philanthropic spaces of the North, right? The networks, and getting engaged and trying to understand what was the field. And finally, after many, many years, we realized that we were showing up, but not being seen, because we were something new to the field. The field had long-standing practices of, let's say, the large donors, right, the endowed foundations, and what they and most people still call, but it's less and less, intermediary funds that are sitting in the North, who actually, those have been the allies of the Global South for 30 years. But then we started showing up. And why? Because we realized that there was a huge gap that nobody could fill from the outside. That the only way to fill is by being insider, by belonging to the culture, to the community, by figuring out through the causes, through the networks we work with, how do you listen to them and see what they need and set up from there a structure that can serve, that can resource what's necessary, but in scale. But it's not an upscale, it's an outscaling. It's how many grants, how can you put resources in scale in the hands of small communities spread all over the Global South, so that they can come up with their solutions and they can execute the solutions that they know they understand, that they always have had, but that they had no opportunity to do themselves. So this is where we come from, these funds. And finally, we realized that the only way to be able to send a real message that we are a partner of the global field, a new partner, and that we would like to be understood by what we are, by the new methodologies that we developed to resource our peers and our partners in our countries. Plus, because we are locals, we are the only ones that can actually stimulate local philanthropy, which is another very big role of local funds. So one of the things we did in Brazil was to help create the network, the philanthropy network for social justice, that involves many other kinds of funds, human rights, women's and racial equity, and so many others. And eventually, Casa stimulated the creation of 5 new socio-environmental funds in South America and in Mozambique. And then suddenly we were 9 funds. So we said, okay, this is our chance. Now we actually can explain together what we mean by socio-environmental funds of the Global South. The activists coming together to show a whole other way of doing something. And it is another way. And I'm really glad that we can share a little bit of this. I don't know how much time, I know you asked. And I'd like to say something about the Mackenzie Scott.
Yes, I was going to ask that as a follow-up. So please, actually, if you could share a bit about that experience and maybe your plans for that grant as well, that would be great to hear.
I think the message that she sent was, and I'm glad that somebody from Bridgespan's here, because I know they had a huge role in whatever, the most amazing thing for most of us, it's not just us, Casa, it's several of our socio-environmental funds. It's the human rights funds, the women's funds, that we know that put in this round alone, around $150 million to women's funds around the world. So it's the same thing I'm talking about. We are activists dealing with our own issues. How could she see us before our own wealthy people in our countries? Actually, most of us who have been here for 20 years, in Brazil at least, and other countries, and I know it's a fact in the Global South in general, the local wealth, they create their new structures, but they don't see us. It's amazing that we are invisible to them, although we have distributed millions together to build democracy in our own countries and regions. Still, it's somebody out there who realizes the value of this. So I think this is mostly what's important to say, and I think the big lesson here that she wrote in that statement is, and that's a real message to the field. You cannot know what is needed from the outside. No matter how much you want, how much you care, it's impossible. There are things that are impossible to know or to guide from the outside in. You need to trust. It is about trust. It's everything we do is about trust, and it's about collaboration. It's about not competing. Casa was the only socio-environmental fund for South America. Now we are 5 because we are sharing what we learned with our peers, because it's the only way that local groups are going to have more resources. If the local people who understand that culture and who operate in local currency, which is a big thing here, because it's impossible to send money from the outside to certain levels of community work. So it is. We are one more player that would like to be recognized and would like to sit and talk to the long-standing field, and so that we can do better for all of us, right? Because that's the purpose, ultimately. All right.
Thank you, Amalia.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear that story of how the Casa Fund has now sort of helped grow the network of socio-environmental funds in Latin America. And also congratulations to you guys for your grant from Mackenzie Scott. That's also a very exciting vote of confidence in this work, I think.
Definitely.
But now I'd like to open the floor for Ati, who's joining us from the African Visionary Fund, which I think does sort of similar work where you're trying to sit close to your grantees, work with them, find them. And I know one of the things that's unique about your organization is that you have a co-leadership model. And I was wondering if you can share with us a little bit about how that sort of helps you work across the North and South.
Yes, thank you, Elika. I'm not sure why my video is not working. I don't know if you can see me.
It is. We can see you.
Okay, it's showing blank on my side. Great. Okay, thank you for that. I'm joining you today from Arua in Uganda, where I'm visiting our partner, Kajo PG Health Institute, and I'm really excited to be speaking on this topic. At the African Visionary Fund, our mission is to drive more funding to African visionaries and to accelerate their impact. And we connect innovative African founders with resources they need to positively impact their communities. And since we launched in 2020, we have committed over $2 million in unrestricted and multi-year grants to 15 organizations across 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Our long-term goal is to change how the philanthropic community views and funds Africa leaders. Currently, only 0.4% of the international humanitarian funding went to African NGOs in 2018. This is according to the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report of Development Initiatives. Also, the Council of Foundations had a report that was on the state of US giving, global giving by US foundations, which showed that about 5% of US grant dollars directed to sub-Saharan Africa went to actually local organizations. So it's a huge problem here. And simply put, locally led organizations are just not getting funded equitably, although they are doing incredible work to serve their communities. And as you mentioned earlier, equity is at the heart of the work we do at the African Visionary Fund, which is why we have structured a co-leadership model. So I lead with my co-CEO, Katie, who is based in the US. I believe that one thing I really like about this model is that I believe that change within funding organizations like ours starts at the executive and board leadership level. And shifting inequitable power dynamics is not just about transforming leadership, but it's about expanding leadership. And that happens through creating opportunities for to collaborate with one another towards a shared vision. So how we do this, Katie and I, my co-CEO, is that we both want to create a more equitable philanthropic environment. And we both know that we need more diverse representation and in governance structures. So with that shared vision, we have an opportunity to contribute to different strengths and perspectives. Katie brings significant strength, especially in the proximity to funders, and has cultivated a good deal of relationships in that area and has been instrumental in raising funds for the African Visionary Fund and setting vision for the organization with me. And I have proximity to the context and challenges faced by African leaders, especially in the nonprofit and social enterprise sector, that I bring to help us build our grant-making model and our portfolio services. Our co-leadership structure across continents is, I think, a good example of how partnership and equitable decision-making can create a funding model that shifts the power imbalance over time. Because we all know that this issue is not created, over a short period. It was created over a very long period of time, and it will take time to change. And we recognize that we're brand new and we're still experimenting, but we know that there needs to be a change in order to level the playing field in philanthropy. And that really means it's not just reimagining, it's actually thinking of new systems. How can we create new systems of funding? How can we create new ways of doing, building that relationship between the funder and the organizations that are working on the ground? And I think I'm kind of going to close by saying we're willing to be the guinea pigs for building a more sustainable and equitable model. And we have been doing this for the last 2 years, and we look forward to many more opportunities and challenges to continue to shift and level the playing field. Thank you, Alika. Back to you.
Thank you, Adi. I think the co-leadership model that the African Visionary Fund uses, and I know you, of course, are not the only ones that have a co-leadership model, but I think having you in Africa and Katie in North America, I think it's a really good example of something that organizations that, have money that they're taking from philanthropists in the North and then they're distributing it to grantees in the South. I think it's a model that seems like a really practical step people can put into practice. So I would love to see how this develops in the future and how more, if there are more organizations that can take it into their own practice.
Yeah, and I think part of it is really thinking about how do we not make it where, like for us, it was important to make sure that the agenda is just not set in in North America, and we're just here to implement it. Because sometimes what happens is, on paper, you might see that organizations are trying to level the field, but in practice, the power dynamic still exists. So it really is a way of work that really requires for people in that organization to truly, really believe that we are all partners in this work. And we really have to think of each of us bring different things to the table that are critical to make this work successful.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we'd like to hear from Anant, who is joining us today from India and representing Bridgespan. So Bridgespan, I'm sure everyone knows, but I'll say it anyways. It's a consultancy that works with global philanthropists to help them get their funding to nonprofits and NGOs all around the world. So Anant, could you share with us a little bit about how Bridgespan sees its responsibility in leveling the global playing field in the advice that you give out to funders?
Sure, and thanks so much. It's exciting. It's a huge honor to listen to, the speakers, and really, I'm filled with a sense of gratitude that this work is happening across the world. I'd love to take a step back to I think what we heard Maria talk about, which is why does this issue exist? Why is it rare to find trust-based behaviors, both internally and externally? And I think it's important for us to think about it and acknowledge why the issue exists so that we can solve it. I think it's interesting to also recognize that it's very easy to get tokenistic about this topic, and it's going to lead to a lot of talk but no action. So I think it's important that people like this group stay wary of tokenism. So going right back to why this exists, I'm going to start with an organization. Earlier I used to work in the for-profit world in large multinationals, now in Bridgespan and other places. And I also see foundations very closely, and of course, also Indian donors. There is a huge trust deficit. The trust deficit is between philanthropists and NGOs. The trust deficit is actually also between, in many organizations, the global north and global south. And till there is trust deficit, you will see behaviors around ego. There will be behaviors around control. There will be behaviors around short-termism. And all these behaviors are counterproductive to impact and sustainability and just solving the problem. So at the very heart of it, I think Maria spoke about this. Without trust, it's very hard to solve this. And as we also try to go under the skin of why does this trust deficit exist? In many cases, it's simply because that has been the power structure, which has happened over many decades or many centuries. So I think step one is to acknowledge that there is a power imbalance, and we have to acknowledge why this power imbalance is counterproductive. The panelists spoke about three things. I think one is there is no way someone far away across the seas will figure out what's the challenge. I think there is no way even someone sitting in Mumbai will actually figure out the problem in a village. Like, it's just impossible. And while there is obviously a lot of merit in SDGs, I think the second challenge is all these SDGs are intersecting each other as you come down to the community level. It's very hard for a girl to go to school if she's facing violence on the way. It's very hard for her to stay in school if the toilets are not functional. So it's very hard for someone sitting far away to think about what to solve. And then the third one is because there is a trust deficit, there is a need to see immediate action and immediate results. And the reality is, the immediate results are only going to be superficial because many of these things are fundamental. So I think one way to think about this could actually be if we are able to solve for trust internally in organizations, including NGOs, including larger organizations, but also between the global north and global south, then many of these good behaviors will start happening more. We are seeing great examples of that, like you talked about, and there are some more. But shockingly, if I look at Indian philanthropists, it's nothing to do with US or India or Africa. The same behaviors of ego, control, short-termism, and siloed thinking exist. So I think this group has to actually work very hard to put trust at the center and make the case for trust. And that I think is important to happen as we take this ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anant. Yeah, I think it's an interesting point we need to think about. Like I was saying earlier, it's not this idea of just shifting practice, it's shifting ideology, which is really where trust comes from. It's not our vocabulary and just our actions, it's the beliefs we hold at the heart of the work we do. And I think that's where we'll actually start to see the change. But speaking of vocabulary, we now have a poll question for our audience. So that's going to be before we turn to our Q&A. So just a reminder to everyone who's listening, if you have a question for any of our panelists, you can go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll try our best to get to them with the time we have left. But the poll question we have for everyone is the terminology of global north and global south outdated? The answers are yes, it's actively unhelpful. Yes, but it's the best terminology to describe what we mean for now, or no, it's fine. So I'm going to leave that open now to give everyone a chance to respond. But we'd also be interested to hear if you think that global north and global south are unhelpful terms, what terminology do you think would be good to use instead? So if you have any thoughts about that, go ahead and share it in the chat. And we'll come back to this in a few minutes once everybody's had a chance to think about it and respond. But for now, I'd like to open our Q&A. So one of the questions that we had in advance is, are millennials and second generation philanthropists driving better practice within their own organizations when it comes to improving relationships between the North and South? And I'd like to direct that one to Anant, actually, if you can come back on. And I think actually if we could all turn our video on now, that would be great. And we're going to minimize the slides during the Q&A. Sorry, so I'm going to hand the question now over to you, which was, are millennials and second generation philanthropists driving better practice? Have you seen that in your work?
Sure. Thank you. That's a great question. We're coming very recently out of talking with about 50 philanthropists across different age groups and spectrums. I think the one thing which is coming through, it's not surprising, is those who have actually seen the value of collaboration across these barriers. For them, this is a no-brainer. And those who have not seen it, so I have seen millennials, I've seen fairly young philanthropists who actually feel they know all the answers, they can do it all, and like there is a very strong bias to control. I have also seen others who say, look, this is how I have actually succeeded in my life as I have made my money. So I think it goes back a little bit to the value systems of what has made that person successful. And maybe one additional point is those who have seen the success happen and then have had a failure as well, and have seen the humility of actually the failure, are potentially far more open to saying, look, I may not know it all, and I'm open to learning. So I think there is something about the life stage, and there is also something about having seen the value of collaboration in life. But surprisingly, I've seen both patterns in millennials. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Riva or Amalia, do you have any reflections on this question you want to share? Riva, shall we start with you? Did you have any thoughts? Or Amalia, go ahead.
Oh, well, I think there's a lot of gaps when you are sitting where we are right now. And I'm seeing this whole thing about global south that I want to speak to later as well. But there's a culture. There's a culture of such a huge gap in our countries of the top wealth that they don't live here. Seriously, they were raised globally. They were, having access to the wealthiest structures. Anyway, so it's like, and we are in corrupt societies. Dangerous, because the bigger the gap, the more dangerous it is for the people at the top layer. But at the same time, they own 1% of the population, own 80% of the land. So anyway, everything is just so wrong that we understand how difficult it is for these people, who are raised in this other world, to access this information. And this is one of the roles of funds, local funds like us. Develop very strict systems of accountability and transparency. Do a really good job that is recognized even around the world, so that eventually we will gain that trust, and these gap will it's a process. Yeah. It's beginning to filter, and hopefully it will increase as we stimulate conversations like this.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think it's important to note that, when we speak about, maybe things are changing with the youth, like these attitudes, it's not just changing with a generation, it has to change with an effort and the work of a generation and all of that. Before we move on to the next question, I just wanted to go ahead.
I'm sorry, and one small point there. I think this is a great point, which is expecting this behavior to change with changing generations is maybe being like too optimistic. Like I think Maria said, there has to be philanthropy is an area where there is no external accountability, none. So all accountability has to come from internally. So then what is internal accountability in philanthropy? It is peer pressure. It is getting a sense of like, who do I role model, right? There are some of these factors. So I think it's quite critical. It's even more important in philanthropy to start creating these pockets of, like beacons of hope, and talk about them. And as this happens, some of this will start changing. But, one needs to recognize that the power dynamics are actually very strongly weighted against these. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to actually speak about this question of internal accountability in philanthropy. I'm wondering, is that something that comes up in your work at the Radical Flexibility Fund, Riva? Is that like a part of what you try to push your partners towards?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just jump in quickly on the last question also, I was thinking about this from a maybe my fellow panelists will think this is very optimistic, but I was thinking about this more from the demand side, less from the side of philanthropists, but more from the side of entrepreneurs and the next generation of social change professionals in the global north and in the global south. And I just wanted to add that my perception from working with this next generation is that I don't think they will tolerate these dynamics. I think that there is a lot more awareness of power and these issues, maybe not as much among young philanthropists, but again, speaking of social change professionals and those who are getting master's degrees and seeking to gain expertise in this field, I think the innovation, and this is the work that we really seek to amplify, and this is how we understand our role sitting in New York City in the global north. Whether we agree or disagree with that term at RFF, is really amplifying the work of those, that are doing innovative things in the global south. And again, I think that work is most exciting in places like Sao Paulo and Nairobi and Mumbai, and I think they're going to keep doing it anyway. And their sort of perceptions in 20 years, I do think that these issues are going to have shifted, because this next generation isn't going to, rely on this current paradigm and these power dynamics, and they're just going to keep showing us that they have innovative approaches to these issues. So just to add on that, and on the internal accountability, as someone relatively new to philanthropy, I will say that has been a shocking aspect of that field to me. It's, the sort of, I'll speak to the United States, the fact that funders are really only held accountable to the sort of tax system and whether their funds, were legitimately donated according to the International Revenue Service of the United States is really shocking to me. And so, as I mentioned, one of our tenets is really encouraging accountability to communities. And I won't go through them, but in the 10 radical actions on our website, we've tried really hard. All of our work is practical. We've tried really hard to, raise questions, ask practical things, and it's to donors to figure out how to ask these questions within the systems that they work in. But, the questions that I raised, for example, all relating to how are you holding yourselves accountable to the communities in which you work versus your board of trustees? These are questions that are possible to ask. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Reba. Before we move on to the next question, Adi, I know we lost you for a minute, but we were speaking a little bit about if we're seeing changes in the way the next generation of philanthropists is working on some of these issues. And I was wondering if you had a comment on that question.
Yes, I'm also trying to run away from the sun, so I'm sorry about this. I do, and I think we generally give millennials a little bit too much credit. As a millennial myself, I think we're always hopeful that the next generation is going to do it better, and that's not always the case. I think if we really look at millennial philanthropists or second generation philanthropists, there might be a little bit more awareness and they might talk about it, but there still is the savior mentality that permeates philanthropy. And the other part is that I think what's really needed is that young people that are in that position of wealth have to really understand that there are significant inequities in this world that are putting them in the position they are in the first place. That are making them, the philanthropists and other youth their same age, the ones that are receiving the funds from them. So I think that's one thing that I think we have to continue to push young people, specifically young people with wealth and those who are philanthropists to do. And other is that I think we really also need to think about, like I said, not just accountability, but how do you think about accountability and who are you accountable for? Are you accountable for the wealth and the source of the money, or are you accountable for the people that money is supposed to be serving? And I think we still have boards in family foundations and large organizations where the board and the executive leadership is still the wealth side, and then the implementers are those with the problems that are trying to be solved sometimes. So how do you really think about, if there's no accountability to the people that you're serving, then, and we have to also remember, I think someone a little bit ago mentioned this, specifically in the US, we have to be honest about why there's philanthropy, and it is really for tax purposes. To the level that it is. And it's really not to serve or help anybody. It also is a very smart mechanism to move generational wealth down. So I think I'm saying all of that to say, yes, there is some change specifically on millennials that are working in philanthropy, but not those who are philanthropists and have the money that moves all of this stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Adi. I think some of what you're saying is connected to this idea of the trust deficit that Anant was speaking about earlier. And I do want to discuss that, but actually before we come to that, I'd really like for us to all comment on this poll question where we asked our audience, is the terminology of global north and global south outdated? So 69% of our attendees said yes, but it's the best terminology we have to describe what we mean for now. 27% said yes, it's actively unhelpful, and 2% said no, it's fine. So I also asked in the chat, if we're not saying global north, global south, what should we be saying? And a couple people have said global majority. I haven't seen so many other answers, but I would like to hear now, do you think it's helpful to speak about like the global north, global south divide in those vocabulary words, or do you think there is a better way to speak about it? And maybe we could start with Amalia. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Oh, yeah, I would like to find a better word, but we're talking about, of course, everybody knows it's a political global south, so it's everywhere. It's in the northern hemisphere, it's in the east, west, it's about the underprivileged, the ones that have less access, that have been the foundation for somebody else to, some countries or whatever, to get wealthy corporations. So it's the ruling of the world, it's the power and the concentration, and it's everybody else. So to me, we are using it because I can't express that, and I guess that's kind of using the words already. The political statement is inbuilt there somewhere. So it's a little bit like in the past we used to call developing countries. When I was in college in the 80s, and I said, developing towards what? Towards this massive industrialized systems that are eating up the world. Is that what we really mean by developing? So I would say less industrialized. I would say wealthier in terms of biodiversity that we need to protect, and at what cost for locals. So, there's all kinds of imbalances, and this is just a useful term for now. And I haven't been so creative to figure out something else. But so yes, it's not ideal, but it expresses, at least subjectively, what we want to say, right?
Definitely. I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists as well, if you have thoughts on this question.
Sure. So I think once again here, the first step is honesty and acknowledgement. The terminology global north and global south are unhelpful because they're just sugar-coated euphemisms for historical power dynamics. And in the end, they're just catch-all phrases that uphold the status quo. Most honest terms would be colonized countries and colonizing countries and those who were colonized, or not that. I know that sounds unpalatable to a lot of people, but that's really what this language is trying to sugarcoat. It reminds me of, in the US, you say now people of color, or instead of saying, or African Americans instead of saying Black people. So it's kind of like, it's just saying the same thing in a different way. I think there's a way maybe we can say predominantly white countries and countries of color, because it's not a geographic description at all. It really is a description of countries that have caused a lot of the problems that exist in the world, that are now also given the power to say they're fixing these problems, and they're funding, and they're giving the money, and they're saving people. So it definitely is. I don't really know what the right terminology would be, but I think the challenge is that we also spend too much time thinking about the changing language and not enough time on changing the systems that are making this problem continue. So I think that's really where maybe our energy has to be spent, because we wouldn't have to spend so much time redefining terminology if we were actually solving the issues that are causing this huge inequity that we're now trying to be politically correct about. How I remember, like when I was young, it was
one of our audience members, Charlotte Fletcher, who says, it seems like the trust deficit that Anant describes is actually a virtuous circle where trust doesn't, virtuous circle, maybe meant vicious cycle, where trust doesn't exist because of historical global power imbalances. But that lack of trust just serves to perpetuate historical power imbalances. What is going to break that cycle that only serves the global elites? Anant, do you want to come in on this question since you brought this subject up?
Sure, and I'd love to then, hear other panelists. I think this is as much a global issue as a local issue. I'm just going to talk about India. So, as you know, India is a country of huge diversity, religion, caste, geography, ethnicity. So, you name it, we are a very diverse country. And the reason we became independent a very long time back was because there was an ability to rise above diversity to look at what is common to us. And today, as we think about global north, global south, but like I think Maria said, the same global north, global south can happen even within India. It can happen within urban and rural, you can slice it any way. I think the more we ignore the biases which are inherent to us, the more we will, try to avoid the issue through taxonomy or avoid the issue through, what is politically correct. And I think maybe one powerful way to think about this is, as we approach any piece of work, can we make some of these biases explicit rather than letting them be implicit? Even in an organization, as Bridgespan, we are extremely conscious now. We are by no means, perfect at this, but I think the consciousness is increasing about wow, what is the time zone I'm setting up this meeting? And is that time zone actually a very, US-centric time zone, or are we do I know what are the time zones in the 4 offices which exist? It sounds like such a tactical point, but it's a fairly fundamental point because it's a bias. So at some level, I think if we start with simple checklists saying, look, these 5 questions will help us figure out what is, the reality is all of us do have biases. All of us, are sometimes not aware of it. But if you're able to uncover them and surface them, then I think we can start working on this. And I really love what you said, Ati, which is, the taxonomy is less important. I mean, we can call it whatever, but I think this divide exists in all quarters, including within our countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Anant. I think actually this point you've brought up that's so simple but quite profound about when are we even scheduling our meetings. It's a very practical thing that all of us that work with people in other parts of the world can bring into our work. And I would actually just love to hear a couple of things from all of you. If you have other sort of small practical steps, what are ways that you bring that into your work to essentially make your work more open and more accepting to people in a different hemisphere to you? If anyone has a couple of things they want to share, it would be great to hear.
I can just jump in and just really agree with everything that's been said, with Ati's great points and Anant's comments. Definitely the practical things are so important. And that also made me think about, I think one of our and my kind of underlying beliefs about this is that these systems aren't a monolith. There are champions and people, working in all of these. It's sort of easy to talk about the system and, these dominant hierarchies and kind of paint them with one brush. And I think, in order for change to happen, the way Anant is suggesting, through these strategies that may seem like tactical strategies, we also need to find the people in these systems who are allies, and they exist everywhere. So, it's a slow process, but I think, speaking about tactical changes, one of our theories is that by sort of feeding these people who work, these people, whether those are, philanthropists or bureaucrats or however you want to define them, by feeding them new strategies for how to more effectively get funding, solve the challenge that Ati mentioned, that I mentioned, we are not getting resources resources directly to these local organizations. Well, tactically speaking, what are better ways to do that? I think that speaks to Anant sort of bringing up these small things that might seem small in cultural changes, but who knows how those will precipitate big shifts, as the years go on. So to me, his comment just spoke to kind of looking for these levers, whether they're people or, tactical strategies to kind of, otherwise the system just becomes overwhelming and feels like this sort of monolith that we're unable to change.
Thank you, Riva. We're actually rapidly approaching the end of the hour, so I want to offer the floor to Amalia and then Ati to say a few last things before we close today.
Yes, well, I've been reading the questions here, and it's just popping up a few things that I always like to leave as food for thought in conversations like this. Ultimately, we're talking about power. And ultimately, we're talking about power over all of these systems that we live in this planet are about power over, where money usually plays the big part of the over. So whatever it is, wherever we sit, a simple act of one person who realizes that the money she has is disproportionate, that nobody should have that much money, just decides that she's going to find people. So that's one of the questions. We were found. We have no idea how they got to us to this day. I think this is really brilliant because it brings a recognition about all kinds of things that it levels a little bit more. So we in our work, and I think that speaks for the field in general. How do you level off power? How do you build power with? It's really about what matters most, which is we want to change this world, then we need to change everything about how we do things. So what we did in our model, which we don't get to talk about a lot, but I think I would love to at some point, we built a funding disbursement structure that does a service to larger funders because we are part of the system that we want to change. That's the system's thinking and the levers. And, if you are part of a system, then you are faster at finding the levers. And it's like acupuncture. That's what we're trying to do. So what we did was build a structure to put money out there based on consultation, constant consultation, participation, networking, engaging and listening and consulting. And then we see, okay, that's what you need. We build a call to fund that. And we'll figure out how to convince funders that that's what you need because that's what you are saying you need. So it is a listening. So we are in different parts of this listening system. And if we come together and we feed each other with the information, that's how we're going to do it. So it's all about that. It's power with, how everything that you see that looks like power over. A program officer in a great foundation could be a power over the field because, I get the money. I'm going to fund. It's not my money, right? But I think it is when I have this power to put money out there. But others realize the special role they have, so they will listen. So it is all about conversation and collaboration, and none of us is going to solve. But we need to work together better. And that's not what we're doing. That's one of the big things for us as this new alliance is just a way to show up, We've been doing this, but we've been trying to talk about this for 20 years, and we haven't succeeded because the field also uses this whole, who's at the table, the trust also works in many cases, but trust over trust in a small system also creates exclusion. So it's really all about that. It's about to keep talking, calling out the problems and trying to rebuild so that we can be better and better and better. And we are hoping at least that we can inspire more Global South funds anywhere they are in the world, but local activists, because the closer the resources are to the community, until we have all communities self-resourcing and we're no longer needed. That's really what we want to see. We want to disappear someday when everybody else is already, stronger and doesn't need structures like ours to give, to bridge resources to them. All right, this is a very long conversation, so thank you so much. This is only the beginning, but I'm
Thank
glad
you so
to be
much,
able
Amalia.
to.
We have just hit our hour, but I would like to invite Addie to share any closing thoughts before we sign off today.
Sure. I'll try to be very quick. I think all the panelists have said it already, but the reality that we have to accept is that the reason philanthropy exists is because of the inequities in the world that are created mostly by capitalism and colonialism and white supremacy. And unless we really accept that, we can't really change it. And we all know that who has the power in philanthropy is the wealthiest people in the world who run the largest philanthropic institutions, who are also the very people who benefit from the social inequities in the world. And they also then get a praise for loaning their profits to combat the problems that they benefit from. And they become experts in philanthropy, which is very dangerous because they gain power to set global agenda on socioeconomic issues that they have really no experience in. So I think, this is sometimes difficult to say and digest and accept, but the biggest reason for that, I think, is it's very hard for humans to accept that we have privilege when we have it, and because it makes us all feel like we didn't earn what we have, or we didn't earn the power we have. So it really is whoever has power, whether it is a grant officer or somebody who's tried a philanthropic institution, if you really accept that you have the power, then you can really think about how to change it. And I think we have to face the flaws in the ecosystem, and we have to know that we keep saying system, but it's system that people created. I think someone earlier said it's not monolithic. It's not, it can be changed. So, and that can come in as small as what was said earlier. I think Anant said it around changing the hours that you do a call. It can be done in ways we've done it at the African Visionary Fund around how we do our grant making, where we have grant making committees that are predominantly from the communities that we're serving. So the decision on who receives the money is not really put on us. We just become facilitators. So there are ways these things can be changed, and some of them are small steps and some of them are bigger steps. But I think it's really starts with all of us acknowledging that we have privilege to be sitting here today, to have this conversation about this topic that, as most of us said, it's been talked about since probably before I was born. So it really is, we have the power to change this, but that takes everyone to take the steps and to look at everything and not just take a system that was there and assume that it works. We have to question, why is a process put the way it is? Who put that process in place? Why did they put it there? And does it work? And who does it benefit? And oftentimes it doesn't really benefit the people on the ground. So it's I think Maria and Riva also said, this is a very long conversation, but I encourage all of us who are in this industry to really think about what power do we have and how do we part with that power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ati. And thank you so much to all of our panelists today. You've given us a lot to think about. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So if you have enjoyed today's discussion and you found it helpful and engaging, don't forget you can subscribe to Alliance with a discount code, which is event22. We're going to be sending all of this information around in an email after our event ends, as well as a recording of the event to anyone who registered but wasn't able to join us today. So I'd like to end by saying thank you to our expert panelists, Adi, Anant, Amalia, and Riva. Thank you to the Alliance team, and in particular, our marketing, advertising, and events manager, Anne-Marie McQueen, who produced today's event. And thank you to all of you for being part of the Alliance community today. Our next event is in June at the AVPN conference in Indonesia, with a live stream for everyone who's not in Bali. And it will explore learning from failure in philanthropy, which is the subject of our June print issue. And if you enjoyed the subject that we spoke about today, keep an eye on Alliance, as we'll be publishing an entire issue on decolonizing philanthropy later this year. So we'll hopefully be able to pick up some of these questions that we weren't able to fully explore with just our hour today. But thank you to everyone for joining us today, and see you next time.